So as the name implies, the GFX2 is a follow-up to its predecessor, the GFX 100. The GFX 2 has absolutely packed the camera with a whole lot of upgraded features that make this a no-brainer for anyone that's looking to upgrade from the GFX 100. For the sake of clarity between the two models, I'm going to be referring to the previous GFX 100 as the GFX 100 and the most current GFX 100 Mark II as simply the GFX 2. For starters, the camera has been redesigned. This camera weighs 1,000 grams in comparison to its predecessor, which weighs roughly 1,300 grams. What's credited to the significant reduction in weight to this camera is the vertical grip is now detachable. The GFX 2 does not include this vertical grip, although you can buy it separately and attach it to this camera if you prefer that shape, but still want the upgraded capabilities of the GFX 2. The vertical grip is ideal for those of us that want a bit more flexibility in how we hold this camera, so if you want to move to a vertical format or a horizontal format, you can do so very easily thanks to this grip. Additional features about the design of this camera is you have a trigger on the far left of the camera that ensures that you can switch between the movie and camera modes of this camera. On the side here, you also have an Ethernet port, so you can connect this camera to Wi-Fi or directly to your computer if you want to. You also have a freeway tilt touchscreen, which is ideal for anyone who hangs out purely behind the camera and needs to get particularly awkward angles, but has the tilt screen to rely upon. One of the other really distinct things about this camera is on the top, you have a sub menu. This is a little screen that displays all the necessary information and camera settings on your camera. The black screen on the white writing I find is very useful in situations when you have to shoot in a dark space and have your subject in the light. You can still sort of make out your camera settings just by looking at the top. Another benefit of the sub menu is that it also stays on when the camera is off. So you can simply look at the camera and see whatever the previous settings were when you turned your camera off. The camera is also dust and moisture proof and is able to operate at -10 degrees Celsius. Keep in mind this doesn't completely weatherproof the camera as you do still have an exposed sensor, so you want to make sure whatever lens you're using is also weatherproof as well. The sensor in the GFX 2 is a significant upgrade in comparison to the GFX 100. This camera is 102 megapixels, so you're getting a crazy amount of resolution and options for cropping in post. In addition to that, the camera is also a 1.7 times the size of a full-frame sensor. So you have a camera with a lot of information in its sensor alone. The options for cropping were particularly useful in regards to animals, as I was able to crop in and get some really detailed shots of animals without having to physically move in close enough to the point that I scare them off. I do regret not bringing a tripod, as what I found is that you could crop in at such a crazy amount with this camera that you were actually able to see the subtlest bit of motion blur from the shutter speed. So if you want to make the most of this camera, I would pack a tripod just so you get those options in post-production to really crop in on your image. That said, the in-body stabilization of this camera is another really big upgrade and works fantastically, as you can see in these shots. This camera has 8 stops of in-body stabilization. In comparison to previous models of the GFX series, the GFX 100 had 5.5 stops and the GFX 100S had 6 stops. So you're getting a camera that's upgraded the in-body stabilization to an amazing degree. The GFX 2 has a new and improved processor, the X Processor 5. This means that the camera operates at double the processing speed as the GFX 100. In terms of shutter speed, the GFX 2 goes up to 8 frames per second. The camera has also implemented deep learning software, which is identical to another Fujifilm camera, the X-H2S. This means the camera has been crammed with AI software, which enables it to identify subjects and eyes incredibly quickly. This camera isn't just trying to be a photographer's camera, it's also trying to be a videographer's camera. And the specs in this camera do reflect that. With this camera, you have up to 8K at 30 frames per second, whereas the previous GFX 100 could only do 4K. So you are getting a crazy amount of options when it comes to shooting with this camera. You can also shoot at 60 frames per second at 4K with no crop, and 120 frames per second in full HD for your slow-mo shots. The coloring and format in this camera is also absolutely fantastic, as you have a chroma subsampling of 422 and a bit depth of 10. If you want to really make the most of the video quality in this camera, you can externally record at 422 12-bit in ProRes or Blackmagic RAW. So you're getting yourself a visually lossless form of footage with a crazy amount of color detail in your image. So something I find with a lot of cameras is often you are sort of limited in the sort of cards that you can use. But when it comes to the GFX 2, you do actually have quite a few options in regards to recording. If you look on the side here, the camera has two ports, one for an SD card and one for a CF Express card. I do recommend using a CF Express card for your 8K footage, as the SD card will probably be lucky to last a few minutes recording 8K footage. But the other thing that I like about this camera is it does have SSD recording. So I can plug in an SSD drive onto this camera and record directly into that. And when I'm recording directly into an SSD drive, I am getting that 12-bit 422 ProRes/Blackmagic RAW quality footage on my camera. An SSD drive is also more cost effective. It's also a device that's a lot harder to lose, as it's a little brick as opposed to a tiny little card. And it's also a lot more universal with other devices, as it does utilize a USB-C port. So whether you have an SSD drive, a CF Express card, or even just a run-of-the-mill SD card that you've grabbed from a nearby local shop, this camera is able to accommodate the most common types of memory input for a camera. So it's good to have a bit of that maneuverability when it comes to recording on this camera. Another cool little quick thing about this GFX 2 is it also has a detachable electronic viewfinder. It's a very simple run-of-the-mill click and remove, and that's nice because sometimes you want to actually utilize this camera as a video camera, which means you want to sort of remove as much of the bulk and disjointed pieces on this camera so you can really gear it up and pack a cage on, a monitor, or whatever else you might need. So now my only problem is losing the electronic viewfinder, so keep it close, keep it safe. The lens I used is the Fujinon GF 55mm 1.7 WR-R lens. This is actually the widest lens in the GF range. It's a 44 and a 35mm equivalent lens, and it has 1.7 max aperture, making an ideal lens for a great amount of detail in low light situations. Inside the lens you have 11 diaphragm blades, which means the bokeh in this camera is very circular and soft. In terms of weight, the lens also weighs 790 grams, and it's also a weather-resistant lens that can operate at up to -10 degrees Celsius and is dust resistant. So if you combine this lens with the GFX 2, you are getting complete dust and moisture resistant at -10 degrees Celsius. The lens also has a DC motor inside it, enabling it for much faster and more efficient autofocus. So if you combine this lens with the GFX 2, you do find you're getting the best of both the AI autofocus and the mechanical autofocus. Now, admittedly, I think the situation I shot in, which was the middle of the day in a very public sort of space, really did test the camera, and it really did sort of struggle a bit with the autofocus, as it did have so many subjects in shot, so it didn't really know who to focus on at any given time. And also it was a little bit overexposed at some sections, as again, you had direct sunlight. The GFX 2, I think honestly, if you're into the GFX series and you can afford it, it's honestly a no-brainer to purchase. The 8K video quality footage, the 8-stop stabilization, the improved and sleeker design, this is a really fantastic camera for any Fujifilm users. What's going on inside is just absolutely amazing and really does rival any other camera on the current commercial market. So tell me, what do you think of the GFX 2? Do you think it's worth the upgrade, and how do you feel it compares to the GFX 100? Please let us know in the comments below.